The morning fog clung to Rechlin airfield like a memory that refused to fade. It was March 17th, 1943, and the sky above Brandenburg held the weight of history in its grey silence. Inside a hangar, marked only by faded Luftwaffe insignia, a group of German pilots stood motionless, their breath rising in thin clouds. Before them, bathed in pale light filtering through bomb-scarred skylights, sat an American bomber that had no right to be there. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, coded DL+XC, rested like a captured god on the concrete floor. Its olive-drab paint was scraped and blistered. Its plexiglass nose bore the scars of flak and cannon fire. Yet despite the violence written across its aluminum skin, the aircraft exuded something that unsettled even the most hardened fighter pilots. Presence. Power. A quiet defiance that seemed to say it had been built not to surrender, but to endure. Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt stepped forward, his flight boots echoing against the cold floor. He was 31, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had flown against hurricanes and Spitfires, who had tangled with yaks over frozen steppes. He had seen the best the Allies could throw at him, but this four-engined beast, was different. He circled the aircraft slowly, running his gloved hand along the nose. The metal was cold, indifferent. He counted the gun positions: chin turret, cheek mounts, waist guns, tail turret, ball turret beneath the belly, like a steel egg waiting to hatch violence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 13 machine guns, someone murmured behind him, all 50 caliber. The number hung in the air like a challenge. 13. Not small caliber rifles or defensive pop guns, but heavy Browning M2S, the same weapon the Americans mounted on their fighters, the same weapon that could punch through armor plate at 1,000 yards, but mounted here, on a bomber, in overlapping fields of fire that turned the Flying Fortress into exactly what its name suggested, a castle in the sky. Reinhardt had read the intelligence reports. He knew the specifications. 750 rounds per minute per gun, muzzle velocity nearly 3,000 feet per second, effective range beyond half a mile. But numbers were abstractions. They lived on paper, in briefing rooms, in the mouths of men who had never faced the reality of what those numbers meant. Today, that would change. The mission briefing had been simple. Fly the captured bomber, experience what the Americans experienced, understand the weapon system that had been bleeding the Luftwaffe white over the skies of the Reich. The bomber had been captured 3 months earlier, force-landed near Melun in France by Lieutenant Flickinger's crew after a mission to Rouen. The Germans had repaired it, flown it to Rechlin, and now, after months of careful study by engineers and ordnance specialists, it was time for the pilots to meet their enemy from the inside. Reinhardt climbed through the waist hatch, pulling himself into the fuselage. The interior was cramped, utilitarian, stripped of any comfort or elegance. This was not a machine designed for grace. It was designed for function, for violence delivered at altitude. He moved forward through the narrow passage, past the radio operator's station, past the bomb bay that yawned empty and dark, until he reached the flight deck. The cockpit was surprisingly spacious compared to his Messerschmitt 109, 2 seats, side by side. Instrument panels are crowded with gauges and switches, throttles thick as a man's wrist, everything oversized, overbuilt, American. He slid into the left seat and wrapped his hands around the yoke. It felt heavy, solid, like holding the reins of a plough horse rather than a thoroughbred. Behind him, the rest of the evaluation team filed aboard. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, a fighter ace with 19 kills, took the co-pilot's seat. 3 more pilots distributed themselves throughout the bomber, manning the gun positions. Chin turret, top turret, tail. They wore Luftwaffe flight suits but sat at American stations, their hands learning the weight of enemy steel. The engines coughed, then roared. 4 Wright Cyclones, each producing 1,200 horsepower, shaking the airframe with barely contained fury. Reinhardt advanced the throttles. The bomber began to roll. He had flown transports before, Junkers 52s and Heinkel 111s, but nothing prepared him for the sheer mass of the fortress. It didn't accelerate. It accumulated speed, slowly, inevitably, like a train gathering momentum. The wheels lifted. Brandenburg fell away beneath them. They climbed into the morning sky, and for the first time, Reinhardt understood what it meant to fly a strategic bomber. It wasn't about maneuverability or grace. It was about carrying the war deep into enemy territory and refusing to be stopped. At 10,000 feet, Hoffmann's voice crackled over the intercom. Formation of 3 Messerschmitts at 2 o'clock low, beginning mock attack run. This was the purpose of the flight. German fighters, flown by pilots who knew every tactic in the book, would simulate attacks on the fortress. The gunners would track them, call out ranges, and learn the dance of defense. But they would not fire. The sky above Rechlin was friendly. The training rounds in the ammunition bays were inert. This was education, not combat. The first Messerschmitt peeled off, diving toward the fortress's nose. In the chin turret, Lieutenant Franz Becker swiveled his twin 50s, tracking the fighter through his reflector sight. His hands moved smoothly, hydraulic motors whining as the turret rotated. The fighter flashed past, banking hard. "I had him the entire time," Becker reported. "No blind spots forward." The second attack came from above and behind. The top turret gunner, Feldwebel Otto Kraus, spun to meet it. 11 o'clock high, 800 meters, and closing. His voice was calm, professional. The fighter rolled inverted, diving past the fortress's tail. The tail gunner, Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, followed him down. "He's in my sights. No escape at this angle." Attack after attack. High, low, beam, stern. The Messerschmitts probed from every direction, searching for the weaknesses they knew from combat, trying to exploit the blind spots that had cost American crews their lives. But sitting inside the fortress, manning the guns that defined its legend, the German pilots began to understand something that no intelligence briefing had conveyed. There were no blind spots. Every angle of approach brought the attacker into the sights of at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4 guns. The overlapping fields of fire created a web of destruction that turned the bomber into a fortress in truth. A castle whose walls were made not of stone but of flying lead. Reinhardt leveled the bomber at 15,000 feet. The engines thrummed with mechanical confidence. Through the windscreen, he could see the Messerschmitts reforming for another pass. Beautiful aircraft. Deadly. Precise. The finest fighters in the world. But against this bomber, in formation with others like it, they would have to press through a wall of fire that could tear a fighter apart in seconds. "All stations report ammunition status," he called over the intercom. "Chin turret, 2,000 rounds available. Top turret, 800 rounds. Waist guns, 2,400 rounds each. Tail turret, 1,100 rounds." The numbers added up in Reinhardt's mind. Over 8,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. If this were combat, if those belts were live, the fortress could sustain defensive fire for minutes of continuous combat. He had watched enough gun camera footage to know that most fighter attacks lasted seconds. A diving pass? A burst of cannon fire, then break away before the bomber's guns found their mark. But what if the bomber didn't miss? What if 3, 4, 5 of those heavy machine guns concentrated on a single fighter? He'd seen the wreckage. Messerschmitts with wings torn off, Fokker-Wulfs with cockpits shredded, Japanese Zeros that had simply disintegrated under the hammer of American 50 caliber fire. The math was brutal. A single hit from a 50 caliber round could cripple a fighter. 10 hits would destroy it, and the fortress could put hundreds of rounds into the sky every second. The mock attacks continued for another hour. The Messerschmitts dove and climbed, rolled and jinked, trying every tactic the Luftwaffe had developed. And every time, the gunners tracked them. Every time, the twin 50s swiveled to meet the threat. By the time Reinhardt brought the fortress back to Rechlin, the lesson had been learned, not through statistics or reports, but through the visceral reality of sitting behind American guns and understanding, finally, what it meant to fly into combat against a formation of these bombers. He touched down heavily, the landing gear groaning under the weight. The engines shut down one by one, their roar fading into silence. In the hangar, the pilots climbed out, their faces thoughtful, their voices quiet. Hoffman stood beside the bomber, staring up at the chin turret. "I've attacked these things head-on a dozen times," he said softly. "I always thought the nose was weak, just a bombardier with a single gun." He shook his head. "Now I know better. The chin turret alone carries more firepower than my entire aircraft." Reinhardt lit a cigarette, his hands steady but his thoughts racing. "It's not just the guns," he said. "It's the philosophy. We build fighters to be elegant, fast, maneuverable. We value the pilot's skill." He exhaled smoke into the cold air. The Americans build their bombers to be unstoppable. They don't trust in skill alone. They trust in overwhelming force. In steel and firepower, and the belief that if you hit hard enough, nothing can stand against you. Becker climbed down from the chin turret, his face pale. "If those guns had been loaded," he said, "if we'd been firing, we could have filled the sky with lead. A fighter wouldn't have a chance. Not one, not 10. They'd have to come in waves, accepting losses, hoping to overwhelm us with numbers." "And they do," Reinhardt replied. "They accept the losses, because they know that for every fighter we shoot down, there are 10 more being built in America. For every pilot we kill, there are 20 more in training." The reality settled over them like the fog that still clung to the airfield. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber. It was a statement, a declaration that the United States had chosen not to fight with finesse or elegance, but with industrial might and overwhelming firepower. And sitting in that cockpit, feeling the power of 13 50 caliber machine guns at his command, Reinhardt had understood the truth. The Americans weren't trying to win with better pilots or superior tactics. They were trying to win by making it impossible to stop them. That evening, the evaluation report was typed and filed. Reinhardt's summary was clinical, professional, defensive armament, exceptional, fields of fire, comprehensive, gunner positions, well designed for sustained combat. But in the margins, in his own handwriting, he added a note that would never make it into the official record. "To fly this aircraft is to understand American warfare. They do not seek elegance, they seek certainty. And when 13 guns fire as one, certainty is what they deliver." The report made its way through channels. Some officers dismissed it. The fortress could be shot down. They'd done it before. They'd do it again. But others, those who had flown over Germany and watched the bomber streams blot out the sun, read between the lines. They understood what Reinhardt was really saying. The war had changed. The Americans had brought to Europe a weapon that embodied their national character, overwhelming force, industrial supremacy, the belief that any problem could be solved if you hit it hard enough. And as the spring of 1943 gave way to summer, and the bomber streams grew larger, and the Luftwaffe's losses mounted, those officers would remember Reinhardt's report. They would remember the day German pilots sat behind American guns and learned that some fortresses cannot be stormed. They can only be endured. The captured B-17 flew again and again over the following months, visiting fighter units across Germany and occupied France. Pilots lined up for the chance to experience the bomber from the inside, to sit in the chin turret and feel the weight of the guns, to stand in the waist and understand the overlapping fields of fire, to crouch in the ball turret and realize that even the belly of the beast was protected. Each pilot who flew in the fortress came away changed, not defeated, but respectful. They had met their enemy, and their enemy was not a machine. It was a philosophy, a way of thinking about war that was fundamentally American. More was better, bigger was stronger, and if 13 guns couldn't stop the enemy, then the answer wasn't to fight smarter. The answer was to build more fortresses. By June, the bomber had been transferred to Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Unit. Painted with German markings, it would fly clandestine missions, dropping agents behind enemy lines, resupplying isolated garrisons. The irony was not lost on anyone. A weapon built to destroy Germany was now serving the Reich. But even as it flew under German colours, the fortress remained American in its soul. Its guns still spoke the language of overwhelming firepower. Its armor still embodied the principle that survivability came from strength, not speed. And its crews, German though they were, could not help but feel a grudging admiration for the engineers who had built a bomber that could take a beating and keep flying. Reinhardt would fly combat missions until the end of the war. He would tangle with P-51 seconds over Berlin, dodge anti-aircraft fire over Hamburg, and watch the Reich crumble beneath him. But he never forgot that morning at Rechlin, the morning he sat in an American cockpit and understood that some wars are not won by the best pilots or the finest aircraft. Some wars are won by the nation that can put 13 guns on a single bomber and build thousands of those bombers. By the nation that values certainty over elegance. By the nation that believes in force, not as a last resort, but as a first principle. Years after the war, in a letter to a former comrade, Reinhardt would write about that flight. "I have flown against the best the Allies had," he wrote. "Spitfires, Hurricanes, Yaks, Mustangs. But nothing impressed me like sitting behind those 13 guns. Not because they were sophisticated, not because they were elegant, but because they were honest. They said, without pretense, without apology, that the Americans had come to win, and they would win by making it impossible to stop them. We called it a fortress. They called it a statement. And in the end, the fortress did what fortresses do. It stood, and we broke against it." The fog had lifted by the time the evaluation was complete. The sky over Rechlin was clear, cold, and infinite. Somewhere to the west, American factories were churning out more fortresses, more bombers with 13 guns, more flying statements of industrial supremacy. And somewhere in that same sky, German pilots were learning that courage and skill were no longer enough. The age of the fighter ace was giving way to the age of the formation. The age of individual valor was bowing to the age of overwhelming force. The Americans had brought to Europe not just a bomber, but a new way of war. And sitting in that cockpit, his hands on American controls, Klaus Reinhardt had been the first to truly understand. The fortress had arrived, and it had come to stay. The summer of 1943 burned across Europe with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. American bomber formations, stacked in their combat boxes, droned eastward day after day, their contrails writing prophecies across German skies. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, and the air above the Reich became a furnace where aluminum and flesh were transmuted into statistics. But in the hidden corners of that air war, in the classified operations of Kampfgeschwader 200, a different story was unfolding. German pilots were flying American bombers, not against the Allies, but in their service. And with each mission, the legend of the fortress's firepower grew. Oberleutnant Martin Schneider stood on the apron at Rangsdorf Airfield, watching as ground crews fueled the captured B-17 designated A3+AE. It was July, and the bomber had been with KG 200 for 2 months. Schneider was 34, a transport pilot before the war, a man who had ferried everything from Junkers tri-motors to captured British aircraft. But he had never flown anything like the fortress. The mission brief had been straightforward. Fly to occupied Poland, drop 3 Abwehr agents behind Soviet lines, return under cover of darkness. Simple in concept, suicidal in execution. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder that consumed men and machines with industrial efficiency. Soviet fighters prowled the night skies. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed every strategic point, and the distances, the vast emptiness of the eastern territories, swallowed aircraft whole. But the B-17 had the range. 4 Wright Cyclones could carry it deep into enemy territory and bring it home, and more importantly, the B-17 had the guns. Schneider walked the bomber's perimeter, conducting his pre-flight inspection. His fingers traced the barrels of the waist guns, cold and dark, and in the twilight. 50 caliber, 13 of them, each one capable of turning a night fighter into scrap metal. He had flown transports before that had been jumped by Soviet fighters. Lumbering Junkers 52s with a single rear-facing gun. The escorts, if they came at all, were often too far away or too engaged to help. He'd lost friends to I-16 seconds and large EG 3 seconds. watched them spiral down in flames over forests that stretched to infinity. But tonight he would not be defenseless. Tonight he would fly to a fortress. The crew assembled in the fading light. Schneider, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Hans Dietrich, 3 gunners, all of them fighter pilots, pulled from frontline units for this mission. They knew how to fight. They knew how to kill. And they knew that the .50 caliber Browning was one of the finest aerial weapons ever designed. The agents came last, 3 shadows in civilian clothes, their faces hard, their eyes empty of everything except mission. They carried small packs, false papers, and cyanide capsules. If captured, they would not survive interrogation. Everyone understood this. It was the price of the shadow war, the war fought in darkness and silence, where even death was classified. Engines 1 through 4 ignited in sequence. The bomber trembled with barely restrained power. Schneider released the brakes, and the fortress rolled into the night. They climbed slowly, altitude gathering like interest on a debt that would come due somewhere over the Soviet Union. At 12,000 feet, Schneider leveled off and set course east. The moon was a sliver, a knife edge of light in the darkness. Below, the landscape unrolled in shades of black and grey, rivers like veins, forests like fur, cities marked by scattered lights, each one a target waiting for bombers that would come, sooner or later, to turn them into ash. Dietrich monitored the engines. All temperatures are normal, fuel consumption within parameters. ETA to drop zone, 4 hours, 17 minutes. 4 hours over enemy territory. 4 hours in which Soviet radar might find them, in which night fighters might vector onto their track, in which 1,000 different failures, mechanical or human, might send them spiraling into the void. But the fortress droned on, steady as a locomotive, its engines singing a song of American engineering, confidence forged in steel. In the waist, Feldwebel Kurt Ritter manned the right gun, scanning the darkness through a viewport scratched and clouded by 1,000 flights. He was a fighter pilot, 23 kills to his name, grounded after a crash that had left his left leg shorter than his right. He walked with a limp now, but his eyes were still sharp, and his hands still remembered the feel of a trigger. The .50 caliber was different from the MG 151 seconds he'd fired from his Messerschmitt, heavier, slower rate of fire, but each round carried brutal authority. He'd test-fired the gun that afternoon, sent a burst into a dirt berm beyond the airfield. The recoil had been immense, the sound like hammers striking anvils, and the dirt berm had simply ceased to exist where the bullets struck. 2 hours into the flight, Dietrich's voice broke the monotony. Contact, radar station, south of our position. They're sweeping. Everyone was tense. Soviet radar was crude but effective. If they were painted, if fighters were scrambled, the night would turn into fire and chaos. Minutes passed. The radar swept again, the signal ghosting across their instruments, then faded. We're through, Dietrich reported. Either they didn't see us, or they mistook us for a Soviet bomber. Schneider allowed himself a small exhalation. Maintain course. Drop zone in 2 hours. They flew deeper into the darkness. Below, the landscape changed. More forests, fewer lights. This was the borderland where civilization frayed, where the war became primitive, fought in mud and snow by men who had forgotten their own names. At the 3-hour mark, shadows appeared in the moonlight. Aircraft, low and fast, climbing toward them. Contacts, Ritter shouted. 3 o'clock low. I make 2, possibly 3 fighters. Schneider's hands tightened on the yoke. Identification? Too far, but they're turning toward us. The fighters closed. In the waist, Ritter tracked them through his sights. The hydraulic turret whined, following his movements. His finger rested on the trigger, waiting for the order, waiting for the moment when silence would shatter into violence. They're Soviet, the tail gunner called. Yak 1 second, definitely hostile. Schneider made the calculation instantly. They were 2 hours from home, deep in Soviet territory, with 3 agents who needed to reach their drop zone. Running was not an option. All gunners, weapons free. Fire on my command. The yaks split, one diving toward the bomber's belly, the others climbing to attack from above. Standard tactics: divide the defensive fire, exploit the blind spots. Except the B-17 had no blind spots. Ritter swiveled his gun down, tracking the belly attacker. The ball turret gunner, crouched in his spherical cage beneath the fuselage, did the same. 2 guns, 4 streams of 50 caliber fire, converging on a single target. Contact! Ritter squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, its muzzle flash blooming white in the darkness. Tracers arced downward, seeking the yak like fingers of fire. The ball turret opened up a split second later. The yak tried to brake, rolling hard left, but it was too late. Both streams of fire converged on its engine cowling. Metal shrieked. The yak's spinner disintegrated. Its engine coughed once, twice, then exploded in a gout of flame that lit the night like a newborn star. The fighter tumbled, already burning, already dead. Splash 1, the ball turret gunner shouted. The other 2 yaks pressed their attack from above. The top turret swiveled, its twin 50s rising to meet them. The gunner, Unteroffizier Franz Müller, was a former Stuka pilot, a man who understood dive angles and closure rates. He led the first yak perfectly, squeezed the trigger, and watched his tracers walk up the fighter's fuselage. Sparks, smoke. The yak shuddered but didn't fall. It fired a burst from its Chevy AK cannon, the shells passing harmlessly beneath the fortress's wing. Then it broke away, trailing smoke, diving for the safety of the clouds below. The third yak came in from 7 o'clock high, a textbook attack angle. The tail gunner, Obergefreiter Hans Weber, was waiting. He'd flown as a gunner on He 111 seconds over Britain, survived 100 night missions. He knew patience, knew when to fire and when to wait. He waited. The yak closed. 500 meters. 400. 300. Weber's finger tightened on the trigger. The twin 50s erupted. The sound inside the tail position was deafening, a continuous thunder that drowned thought. The yak flew directly into the stream of fire. Its canopy shattered, its wing root crumpled. It flipped violently, gyrating out of control, and fell away into the darkness. "Splash 2!" Weber reported, his voice hoarse. The night returned to silence. The surviving yak had vanished, fled or dead, it didn't matter. The fortress droned on, untouched, invincible. Inside the cockpit, Schneider's heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were steady on the yoke, but his mind was reeling. They had been attacked by 3 fighters, 3 Soviet night fighters, skilled and aggressive, and in less than 2 minutes, 2 of them were destroyed. The third had fled. Not because the German gunners were exceptional, not because the fortress was lucky, but because 13 50 caliber machine guns, properly employed, created a sphere of destruction that no fighter could penetrate. "All stations, damage report," Schneider called. "Chin turret, no damage. Top turret, no hits. Waist guns, all green. Ball turret, operational. Tail, no damage. Nothing. The yaks had pressed their attack, fired their guns, and achieved nothing. The fortress had shrugged off the assault like a bear swatting at mosquitoes. Dietrich looked at Schneider, his face pale in the instrument glow. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "Now I understand why the Americans fly these things in daylight." Schneider nodded. "It's not bravery, it's mathematics. If 1 bomber can kill 2 fighters, if 2 bombers can kill 4, then a formation of 100 becomes untouchable." They reached the drop zone 30 minutes later. The agents jumped into the darkness, their parachutes blossoming like pale flowers against the night sky. The fortress turned west, heading home. The return flight was uneventful. No more fighters. No more radar sweeps. Just the steady drone of 4 American engines carrying German pilots back to the Reich. When they landed at Rangsdorf, the sky was greying toward dawn. Ground crews swarmed the bomber, checking for damage, counting ammunition expended. Ritter climbed out of the waist, his ears still ringing from the guns. He found Schneider on the apron, smoking a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. "Herr Oberleutnant," Ritter said quietly, "I've flown fighters for 3 years. I've killed 23 enemy aircraft. But tonight, sitting behind those guns, I felt something I've never felt before." "What?" Schneider asked. "Safe." The word hung between them. Safe. In a bomber, over enemy territory, under attack by fighters. Safe. Because the Americans had built a weapon that didn't rely on the skill of the crew. It relied on the certainty of firepower. On the knowledge that 13 guns, properly distributed, properly supplied with ammunition, could defeat any conventional attack. Schneider nodded slowly. "I felt it too. And it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because if we feel safe in one of their bombers, imagine how they feel in 100, in 1,000. Ritter said nothing. There was nothing to say. The mathematics were inexorable. The Americans were building fortresses, faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, and each fortress carried 13 guns, 13 chances to kill, 13 reasons for German pilots to hesitate, to break off, to die. Over the following months, the captured B-17 seconds of KG-200 flew dozens of missions, supply drops, agent insertions, long-range reconnaissance, and on nearly every mission they encountered enemy fighters, Soviet, British. Even on one occasion, American P-47 seconds that had failed to recognize the fortress as hostile until it was too late. And on every mission, the 13 guns spoke, fighters fell, the fortress flew on, the reputation grew. Pilots who had flown the captured bombers spoke in hushed tones about the experience, about the sense of invulnerability, about watching tracers converge from multiple guns onto a single target, about the brutal efficiency of American firepower. By the autumn of 1943, even Luftwaffe High Command could no longer ignore the implications. Reports from Rechlin, combat assessments from KG-200, gun camera footage from fighters that had attacked B-17 formations and lived to tell about it. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. The Americans had brought to Europe a weapon that fundamentally altered the calculus of aerial warfare, not through technology or innovation, but through sheer, overwhelming force. 13 guns, 4 engines, industrial production that could replace losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, reading the reports in his office in Berlin, understood. "They're not fighting us," he told an aide. "They're drowning us. In steel, in firepower. In bombers that refuse to die." The aide, young and still believing in German technical superiority, protested. "But Herr Feldmarschall, we have the Me-262. We have new tactics. We can still win the air war." Milch looked at him with tired eyes. "Can we? Can we, when a single American bomber carries more firepower than 3 of our fighters? When they can afford to lose 10 fortresses and still complete the mission? When their factories build bombers faster than we can train pilots?" The aide had no answer. No one did. In December of 1943, Klaus Reinhardt, the pilot who had first evaluated the captured fortress at Rechlin, was shot down over Hamburg. He survived, parachuting into a burning city, and spent the rest of the war training new pilots. In the training lectures, he always devoted one session to the American bomber threat. "Forget what you think you know about bombers," he would tell the young pilots, fresh-faced and eager. "The B-17 is not a target. It is a test of your courage, your skill, your willingness to die. Because to attack a fortress formation, you must fly through a wall of fire, 50 caliber fire, thousands of rounds per second, coming from angles you didn't know existed." He would pause, let the words sink in. "I have sat in one of their bombers. I have manned their guns. And I tell you this, if I could choose between attacking a fortress or flying into a flak barrage, I would choose the flak. At least the flak doesn't aim back." The captured B-17 seconds flew until the end of the war. Some were destroyed. Others were abandoned as Allied forces closed in. One, the original Wolfhound, crashed on a ferry flight to Vienna in August of 1944. The crew survived, but the bomber, the first fortress to fly in German colours, was salvaged for parts and never flew again. But the legend endured. Long after the war, Luftwaffe veterans would gather and trade stories. And inevitably, someone would mention the captured fortresses, the missions behind enemy lines, the night when 3 Yaks attacked and 2 fell to the guns, the morning at Rechlin when German pilots first understood what American air power really meant. Martin Schneider survived the war. He moved to South America, started a small aviation company, lived quietly. In 1968, a historian tracked him down, asked him about his time with KG-200, about the captured B-17 seconds, about the night he shot down 2 Soviet fighters. Schneider was old by then, his hair white, his hands spotted with age, but his memory was clear. "You want to know about the fortress?" he said. "I'll tell you. It was the most American thing I ever encountered. Not subtle, not elegant, just brutally, overwhelmingly effective. 13 guns, all of them are saying the same thing. We came here to win, and we brought enough firepower to make sure of it." The historian asked if he had been afraid, flying deep into Soviet territory in an American bomber. Schneider smiled, a sad, distant expression. "Afraid? No, that was the problem. I should have been afraid. I should have been terrified. But sitting behind those guns, with all that ammunition, with all that American steel around me, I felt safe. And that's when I knew we had lost." Lost? The war. We had lost the war, not in 1945 when we surrendered, but in 1943 when I sat in that cockpit and realized that the Americans had built something we could never match, not because we lacked the technology, but because we lacked the philosophy. They believed in overwhelming force, in building not the best bomber, but enough bombers, not the finest guns, but the most guns. And they were right, the historian pressed. But surely German engineering, Schneider cut him off. German engineering built the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, a masterpiece. But it came too late, and there were too few of them. American engineering built the B-17, not a masterpiece, a workhorse, and they built 12,000 of them. Which approach won the war? The historian had no answer. Schneider lit a cigarette, his hands still steady despite the years. "I flew many aircraft during the war, Ju 52 seconds, He 111 seconds, even a captured Spitfire once. But the B-17 was different. It wasn't an airplane, it was a statement. And the statement was this: America had chosen to win through force, through numbers, through 13 guns on every bomber and 1,000 bombers in every raid. We couldn't match that. We couldn't even understand it, not really, not until we sat in their cockpits and flew their missions and felt what it was like to be untouchable. By the time winter settled over Europe in 1944, the bomber offensive had reached its crescendo. 1,000-plane raids, formations so vast they took hours to pass overhead, and in every bomber, 13 50-caliber machine guns. Luftwaffe pilots, the survivors, spoke of the experience in terms usually reserved for natural disasters: hurricanes, earthquakes, forces of nature that could not be fought, only endured. The captured fortresses of KG-200 had taught them the truth, had shown them, from the inside, what American air power meant. But by then, it was too late. The fortresses kept coming, the guns kept firing, and the Reich burned. In the final months of the war, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and American forces closed from the west, the remaining captured B-17 seconds were destroyed by their own crews. Explosives planted in bomb bays, thermite charges in cockpits. The Germans would not let the Allies recapture their own bombers. But even in destruction, the fortresses made a final statement. One of the pilots tasked with demolishing a captured B-17 at Altenburg wrote in his diary, "I set the charges in her belly and walked away. Behind me, she burned, 13 guns melting in the heat, and I thought, this is how they will remember us, not as the nation that built the finest fighters, but as the nation that learned, too late, that the finest fighter is no match for 13 50-caliber machine guns." After the war, when the archives were opened and the classified files revealed, historians discovered the evaluation reports from Rechlin, Reinhardt's notes, Schneider's mission logs, the gun camera, footage from training flights where German pilots had learned to aim American guns, and they found one document that had been classified above top secret, a memo from Luftwaffe High Command to all fighter units, dated September 19, 1943. It read, in part, "Captured American B-17 evaluations confirm defensive armament exceeds all projections. 13 50 caliber machine guns create overlapping fields of fire with no blind spots. Recommend all pilots attacking B-17 formations exercise extreme caution. Frontal attacks, previously considered the safest approach, are now neutralized by chin turret installation. Stern attacks are subject to twin-tail guns with interlocking fire. Beam attacks vulnerable to waist and ball turret coordination. Current tactics are insufficient. New methods are urgently required." Clipped to the memo was a handwritten note, unsigned but attributed to Adolf Galland, General of Fighters. "We asked for their weakness. We found their strength. God help us all." The note was never officially acknowledged, but pilots who served under Galland confirmed its authenticity and its sentiment. By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe had developed tactics to counter the B-17's defenses: heavy cannon armament, rocket attacks from beyond 50 caliber range, the Me-262 jet fighter fast enough to make attack runs before the guns could track. But these were defensive measures, responses to a threat that had already won. The Americans had brought 13 guns to the fight, and 13 guns, multiplied across thousands of bombers, had proven to be an unanswerable argument. The last German pilot to fly a captured B-17 inches combat was never identified. The mission logs were lost, destroyed, or classified beyond recovery. But testimony from ground crew suggests that in April of 1945, with Berlin surrounded and the Reich collapsing, a lone fortress took off from an airfield near Munich. Its destination is unknown. Its mission was unrecorded. It flew west, toward the American lines, and was never seen again. Some believe it defected, others think it crashed in the Alps. A few claim it reached Switzerland and was interned. But the most persistent rumour, the one that circulated among former KG 200 personnel for decades after the war, was that the pilot simply wanted to fly the fortress one last time, to feel, for a few hours, what it was like to be invincible, to sit behind 13 guns and know that nothing in the sky could touch him, to experience, one final time, what American pilots experienced every day: the certainty of overwhelming force. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.